Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Dairy Signal. Whether you're joining from a tractor cap or a break room or even the comfort of your own home, we are grateful to have you tuning in here today with us. I also just want to give a quick shout out to our national partners. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put on programs like the Dairy Signal. So thank you again to our national partners. I just want to remind all of our viewers that today you can have all your questions answered. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, there are three dots. There it will ask you for a prompt of your name. Feel free to put anonymous in there, and we will try to get all of your questions answered here today. So today we're going to be talking about soil testing. We have Tom Schomburg, part owner and agronomist with Tilth Agronomy. So Todd, would you take it away and give a brief introduction for those viewers that haven't heard you speak before?
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, PDP, for having me back. Always love to come on and talk about agronomy and really love to talk about soil sampling. So I work as an independent crop consultant in Wisconsin. We're in the Northeast Wisconsin area with Tilth Agronomy, and we do soil sampling this time of year in the fall, and then kind of write nutrient management plans and scouting in the summer. But one of the big portions of our business is the physical extraction and taking the soil samples, and then we'll send them to the lab and then review the results with growers. So when I started my career as agronomist, that was one of my main jobs was like going out soil samples. So I was lucky. I really enjoyed it. I got to go to Lawton, Wisconsin. I got to go soil sample a bunch down in Illinois in some large fields and really nice soil. So I always enjoyed it because you'd get your hands dirty and you could kind of you in agronomy a lot of times we'll be walking through fields and we see the crop, but there's something about getting your hands dirty and touching that soil and getting a feel for what's going on in your fields. So today we're going to talk about, I got probe and prosper. So using a soil probe, going out there and taking some soil tests and cashing in on soil sampling strategies. So with the tight margins we're having right now and some of that stuff, this is really important. So we're going to talk about why it matters, when to do it, how the process works, and how to interpret the results. So we'll kind of walk our way through that whole process of soil testing.
All right, perfect. Take it away. We're excited to learn more about it all.
All right. So I think now is more important than ever to choose things wisely as far as inputs go. Our current crop prices are very low, but they're not all-time low. They're actually sort of like compared corn and soybeans compared to last year, they're higher than they were this time last year. So what is the problem right now is inputs are extremely high compared to those prices. So it makes it tricky. And with a lot of our producers also being dairymen, sometimes, with the milk prices kind of in that okay range right now. So we want to make sure we really prioritize things and utilize the nutrients we do have out there. So your soil is your bank of nutrients. It it's it can hold phosphorus and potassium for you for future years, future generations to use. So as long as we kind of keep that in check, it'll really help you as a dairy farmer. And so what soil sampling is kind of like your bank statement. So I still do get bank statements monthly in the mail. I some of them I know come online, but when that comes, you can look at that and you know what's in your account. I don't know how many people balance checkbooks anymore either, but take that and then you go and check that with maybe your checkbook and balance that. But that bank statement tells you how much is there. And that's similar to what a soil sample does, is that's telling you how much you have in your current soil bank account. So knowing that balance is very important because then it helps you make decisions on how much fertilizer you may need or manure. So your deposits are your manure, your fertilizer, all that sort of nutrient put in, and then your crop makes the withdrawals. So there over time that can change. And one of the things I always thought is maybe sooner or later we actually would have to soil sample less because we would know exactly how much deposits and withdrawals we make, and then we would see that and it would help us project forward. But the soil is unique and it has a buffering capacity that's hard to tell that all the time. So we do need to take these soil samples every couple years to 3 years to kind of help us know that and when to take them. So I kind of got in this a little bit, but the high input prices is something to talk about. So right now, phosphorus is at, I'd call it an all-time high. It has been higher, but it's very high right now. So phosphorus is quite expensive to buy phosphorus fertilizer. Potassium is above average, but actually in general, potassium's, I would never call it a deal, but it's not crazy like phosphorus. But what soil sampling is going to help us do is really, really dial in that fertilizer dollar so that we know what we're spending and how to spend it. And a lot of people listening today are going to have pits full of manure that they're hauling right now. This also helps to know where to spread your manure, how much manure we should be applying, and how to utilize that manure as best we can out on that landscape and out on all your ground. So that's where this soil testing really helps. So that's the why. So let's dive into the how. So the first would be, how often do I need to sample? Should I sample all the time, every year? Can I do it every 10 years? One thing to start looking at is the nutrient management standard is one spot to start. And the National 590 rule, which is the number, associated with 590 is nutrient management, is they don't really have a date in the national rule. It just says follow your current land grant university guidelines. So if we go then to the state level and look at their guidelines, it varies actually quite a bit by state. So depending what state you're in and listening, it can vary, but California is 2 to 4 years, Indiana, 3 to 4 years, Iowa, 3 years minimum, Michigan, 2 to 3 years, Minnesota, 3 to 4 years, New York, every 3 years. I think you could kind of get the gist a little bit. A lot of these are in the 3 years. North Carolina's unique. That's every 2 to 3 years. But in that state, they actually have a state soil test lab. There's private labs as well, but they have a state lab that'll run your tests for free. We actually got to tour back in March. We were down in North Carolina, and that was really neat. So they actually had a service that basically you could get free samples. They did have a peak time that you did have to pay $4 a sample at that time between December and March, I believe. But each state does have unique things about it. That one was very unique that I've ever seen. Now, all the rest of these states that I know of in general, we use private soil testing labs to send it to, and then we have to pay for that sample to get done. Ohio is 2 to 3 years. Pennsylvania is 3 years. Wisconsin, 3 to 4 years. So the other caveat to this, and maybe the asterisk, would be it also depends on your phosphorus level on the nutrient management standard. So if you have very high phosphorus soils or have a high P index or high phosphorus loss, you might have to soil test more often. Then you might ask, well, that's what the rule says. What should I do agronomically? What's my soil tell me? And that one's a trickier question. As you saw, I just listed off a whole bunch of states that there wasn't much of a consensus. There's a consensus maybe around that 3-year mark. But agronomically, it can depend if you have a very high demand crop or you're starting maybe very low. Maybe you want to do that every 2 years to kind of redo it. And then if you have maybe a low demand crop, very high soil testing, maybe you can push it to the 4 or 5 years. I would say what we see works best is about every 3 years works just fine. It gives us some time in between the soil test to see fluctuations and time to react to it, and then re-up and refresh, and you work off that new sample each time. The next thing to talk about is like the different types of soil sampling. So there's 3 main types that we use. There's composite sampling, there's grid sampling, and zone sampling. So composite's kind of the original soil sampling. That's how it was done originally, where you'd make maybe a W pattern in the field, and you'd have a hand-drawn map typically, or have something that was a guide for you to go out there. But there's no necessarily pattern and there's not as much repeatability with that type of sampling. Sometimes we still do composite, but not, it's very rare anymore to do that type. We typically now go to more grid or zone sampling. And those started with GPS technology. So in the late 90s, when GPS technology became available and we could pinpoint a location with the GPS, then we started building zones that you'd sample around in, or a grid, and you went to an area in a grid and sampled. And these brought a lot more repeatability to soil sampling, which was extremely helpful because one thing to say is it's nice actually when you have a whole bunch of data of soil sampling that you can watch trends over time and see what your soil is doing over time. So not just this one snapshot, but are we going up or down? And with grid and zone, you're going to get a lot more repeatability with that. One negatives can be that on a grid, you might be in, have a few bad locations. So you got to watch out for, ditches, old fence lines, things like that, that you don't want to sample in, obviously, but just things to sort of watch out for. And then the zone sampling, it's how do you build the zones is one thing to think about. So you take basically an area that's similar to each other, and then they might be different sizes actually too. Some could be bigger zones, some could be smaller, but you take different areas and kind of group them together. And there's a few things that work really well for setting up zones. Aerial imagery can work, multiple years of aerial imagery. Electroconductivity, which like a Veris tool or something that's going to map your soil, that we've used a lot to make zones. And then yield maps. So if you have multiple years of yield maps, you can combine areas of like yield and then sample those accordingly. And then soil types is another good way. So what is nice with these, it's a way now that we're managing large fields on a smaller scale. So when I grew up on the dairy farm, my grandpa's farm had it was 100 acres and it had 10 fields in it. So they were 10-acre fields and they were all managed accordingly, and they were small enough that we could manage them separate, and it worked well. As we move into more precision farming, we're able to do that. Now that's all 100-acre field, but we're able to manage it separately with those different zones. So that works really well as well to kind of use either grid sampling or zone sampling. The next question then it goes, how many samples do I need? So I'm going to go out and should I take one to represent the whole field? Should I take multiple? Here's another spot where maybe there's not as much of there's a consensus, but not, it varies by your situation. So in general, in the state of Wisconsin, we're required to do a 5-acre or less, 5 acres per sample or less. So we need to meet that to meet the nutrient management standards. So your state might have a different parameter for that as well. That's the sort of minimum requirement. So in general, that's somewhat the starting point where we use in Wisconsin. But as we want more precision, more precise, we really like to go like a 2.5-acre grid is one way they'll say it, or 2.5-acre per soil sample increment works well. But one of the things to think about is maybe start on a smaller grid. So if this is the first time you're soil sampling, start on a 2.5-acre grid, start on a 1-acre grid, and see what variability is out there. So I've got a picture of a map up here where this is a 2.5-acre grid sample that we started with. There's some variability, but we could pull it back and we could pull some of those points out of here and maybe go down to a 5-acre grid or somewhere in between. So you can maybe look at how variable your soil is and then adjust. The other way to do it is a hybrid approach. That's becoming a little bit more of a newer thing in soil sampling, actually, is that originally it was, we're going to take a 5-acre area and that's the area we're going to represent the spot and move on to the next 5-acre area. And what this hybrid approach is maybe actually in a 10-acre area, I actually need one sample, and because it's just very similar. And in another area, I'm going to need 2 or 3 samples in that area because it just varies a lot. So a hybrid approach is something we're trying. That depends on how variable your soil is. In general, the consensus, if you're going to apply variable rate fertilizer, is sort of 2.5 acre increments. And then, like I said, somewhere between there and 5 acre increments is kind of preferred. The other thing to think about is the less samples you do, maybe the more often you could do them. So if you do like a 40 acre area represented, so maybe you got a 40 acre field, you're just grabbing 1 sample, but I'm going to do that every year. That's another way to think about it. So less samples, but more often. Or like I said, maybe you go just do it every third year and I'm going to do more samples. The next thing is, what tools do I need? So you're all ready to go. What tools do I need to do this? A lot of times you can use a 4-wheeler, your truck, or just obviously something to get out in the field with and make it easier on yourself when you're out there. But the first thing is a soil probe. We prefer soil probes over augers, but the probes are one option. I've got my Oakfield apparatus soil probe next to me here. So this has a footstep and just the nicer tool to use. Still kind of old school, but has a replaceable tip, which is very nice so that we can basically, if these tips go bad, you can replace it and you don't have to just junk the whole probe all the time. Really, probes are getting a lot easier to find. You can go on Amazon now, get probes. Gemplers is another good spot to find soil probes. So that's nice. They even started, this is a bigger version, more expensive. This will run you $150. But they make a smaller version of this, a very small, which is nice if you only have a few samples to do. And that one I think is only like $60. The other newer thing is the Collect and Go soil auger. So this works on your Milwaukee or DeWalt drills, and you could buy them on Amazon. And just a really easy, and it's got a specialized bucket with a hole in the bottom, and you just put the drill in the ground, go to the depth you'd like, and then pull that soil out. So nice, easy tool. That one we've had problems. We don't use those on large scale because we take too many samples that we break them a lot. But on a small scale, they work very, very good. So having a bucket and then having a GPS or something, a map or something to track your location. There's some phone apps available that you can use your iPhone or Android phone to kind of go out there and grab the samples. But that's kind of the tools you need. The other option, we call your agronomist, call your co-op or the soil lab, and they can send somebody out to kind of grab the samples for you.
So Todd, are there any common mistakes that you see producers making while collecting their soil samples that they can try to avoid?
I would say depth is extremely important to watch. We talk a lot about spatial variability, but there's a lot of stratification in our soils and depth. And so if we're uneven with our depth, we're going to have problems. We've even had it where somebody new I'm training to soil sample with us. We'll get the samples back, and the area they did of the field is different than the area I did, and you can just see it was human error. And we'll almost most of the time track that back to depth. That person was maybe not as consistent and maybe doing a little bit different depth than the other person, but that is one thing we try to really watch. The probes we use, either we'll use a Sharpie or a mark it, but the probes have like a 6-inch marking on the Oakfield probe, so you can see right at that 6-inch depth. I know I'm good. And depth's important. We want to go the plow layer in general, your plow depth. So that could be 6 inches, 8 inches, somewhere between there is where we want to be. And like I said, keeping that as uniform as you can. One of the new machines we've got, Wintex, they call it. It's an automatic soil sampler that'll kind of do it for you. And one of the nice parts with that is obviously less labor, but a bigger part is the depth, is that it's getting basically the same depth every time. So we can really take some of that human error out that way. But in general, if you're watching and careful every time you probe the ground, you'll do fine. And you want to grab about 8 to 15 cores per sample area, mix it in your bucket, dump it in the bag to go to the lab. So out of those, it's a lot of cores. It's not just go out, grab a core, dump it, go. You're taking a whole bunch of stabs in the ground and watching each time, make sure your depth is as consistent as you can be.
No, that's great advice for our producers that are watching. So thank you.
And then what time of year is best? When's the best? Fall is in general the best time of year to be out soil sampling. Spring and summer are fine. The biggest part is keep it consistent. So if you're resampling something you did 3 years ago, try to keep it in that same season or even within the same month helps a lot. So like obviously we're in October right now. We're in general grabbing things, resampling fields we sampled 3 years ago in October. So there can be variations from fall to spring. So it's like pH and phosphorus are typically higher in early spring than in fall. So more of that residue is breaking down. The soil's maybe a little different in a different active state. So you wouldn't think it would matter that much, but just keeping it consistent matters. So the spring and summer, if you have to, are fine. Falls just seems the best because the timing works that after harvest, there's still a nice window between there. And if you're going to do tillage or put manure on it, obviously try to sneak out before that and grab that soil sample to get just a better test. But in general, we prefer the fall season. And then where do you go with the samples? So look in your state for a good lab that kind of usually in general your university or there'll be something that has guidelines for methods and extractions that work well in your state. So in Wisconsin, we've got a list of 7 certified labs that are certified through Wisconsin DADCAP that you can basically send the samples to any of those labs and they're certified. They get tested to make sure they're following certain standards. They have to follow certain guidelines for the state of Wisconsin. So that is one thing that is unique is each state has different guidelines and different extractions and different methods. And that can be hard when we're reviewing results too, because something that I look at that I'm used to looking at from a lab that I'm used to could look way different from a different lab or different state. So that is something to consider. And no, a lot of times we try to keep the lab as consistent as we can, that we get a comfort level that their results are similar, and then you get used to going to certain labs. But look in your state for which one's certified and which one to use. And then what do we want to sample for? So today's talk in general, we're talking about what I'd call the chemistry soil sampling or chemical analysis. There's also physical analysis. There's also biological analysis too. And so biological analyses you'd send to very specific labs and they might check for certain things. But for today's topic, we're mainly talking about nutrients and what do we want to sample for that way. So the basic is phosphorus, potassium, organic matter, and pH. That is the sort of the minimum, the basic. That's the starting point of what we want to know is out there. Then we can move into our micronutrients, which would be boron, manganese, zinc, sulfur, sulfate, sulfur, copper, and iron. And so depending on your situation, you may or may not need to know those micros. The other part with the micros is a tissue sample at sometimes is a good way to track your micronutrients versus a soil sample, but they both work well. But that'd be a consideration with micros that sometimes it's helpful when you maybe think you have a problem. But they're very helpful in general to make sure you're meeting, certain criterias for those micronutrients. The other test they do is base saturation. So that uses your cation exchange capacity. So it checks cations like calcium and magnesium. Potassium is also a cation, and it puts it in relation to each other in in the base saturation, and that's just another kind of category that works. And then one maybe you're going like, why didn't I mention it yet is nitrogen. And that one in general in the fall, we don't actually soil test for. In general, we soil test for nitrogen as nitrate in season. So you might do a pre-sidrus nitrate test in corn, when corn is knee high in season, because nitrogen's very mobile. And so that one's tricky. It's mobile in the soil. So it doesn't, to go back to that bank account theory, the other nutrients in general stay in your bank account. Nitrogen, yeah, it ain't gonna stay there. It ain't gonna stay in the bank. So that one is maybe a little different when it comes to soil sampling and how we look at it. And how do we interpret the results? So you're gonna sit down with your agronomist, or you're gonna have a lab sheet in front of you. And I'll be honest, when I get lab sheets, they all look different. They're all kind of daunting, and it's like they're busy. You got all these numbers. Where do you start? Where do you look at? And the analogy I'd like to use, it'd be the same when, as an agronomist, when I look at a feed nutrition test. Well, when I first saw those, I go like, well, give me what matters here. So that's mainly the point I want to drive home. But when I look at a feed test, let's say haylage feed test, now I know, okay, I'm going to look at relative feed quality. Is that around 180 to 200? That's good. I'm going to look at protein. Okay, that's at a 20 plus. That's good. Just certain things where you get those cues of like, okay, the rest of this, I don't need to understand that. The nutritionist will worry about, or let's look at the most important things. Or on a corn silage test, lately I've been looking at a lot of TT NDFDs on corn silage. Is it a 60 or a BMR that's at 65? Like, what's the number? So as a grower out there listening to this, I'm going to alert you to kind of the big ones. And that goes back to that basic test. It's pH, organic matter, phosphorus, potassium. Those are the main four ones I want your eyes to go to. So, and one tricky part is it never says, it just says P for phosphorus, and then potassium is K for the Latin word kalium. So it's confused. So P and K, those are the two I want your eyes to go to right away and look at. And pH is very important. That's an easy building block. And that one, you're going to want to look for a pH around 6.8. So go right to that, look for that. Organic matter, it's going to vary a whole lot by your soil. So if you're sandy, you'd be happy with a 1. If you have clay soils or loams, you'd want, a 3% if you could. But that's another number to look at. And then when we get to phosphorus and potassium, that can differ by extraction method. So I kind of going to layer one other thing on you is that depending on your state you're in, so in the tri-state region, which would be like Purdue, so Indiana, Ohio State, and Michigan, a lot of dairies there, so that's one good one. But the tri-state region, they use the Mehlich extraction method for phosphorus and potassium, the Mehlich 3 method. So you might go like, oh man, but these are all just old scientists that develop methods, and in certain soil types, certain areas like them better. So they use the Mehlich. In Wisconsin, we use the Bray extraction, the Bray 1. So I'm just going to quickly generalize, but in Mehlich, if your phosphorus is between like a 20 and 40, you're good. That's optimum. In Mehlich, if your potassium's over 100, like 100 to 130, for sandy soils, for loam soils, it's a 120 to 170. So just in general on potassium, if it's around a 120, you're good. On the Bray, it's similar, but maybe a little less. So on the Bray tests, optimum is somewhere between 16 and 23 for phosphorus. And for potassium, the optimum is 90 to 120. So just to generalize all that, so you don't got to worry about it. In general, if you have a 20 to 30 phosphorus, you're probably good. In general, if you have about 120 of potassium, you're going to be good. So those are the two numbers I kind of always look for, is sort of that 30 phos and 120 potassium. And then where are my watchouts? On phosphorus, my watchouts single digits. If I have a single digit phosphorus, you want to put manure out there this fall as soon as you can. Potassium, if you're under about a 60, especially under 80, that's my watchout. That's where we're gonna almost for sure see those are in the sort of this, they call it a very low category, and you're almost for sure going to have a response to fertilizer. So you're going to have a gain. So those are like I said, comparing it back to an alfalfa test, the 180 relative feed quality. I'm going to say it one more time. For phosphorus, I want a 30, 20 to 30. And for potassium, I want 120. And if I see those numbers, I'm very happy. That's exactly what I want. If they're lower, we're going to try to manage for the nutrients. If they're higher, then we can use that soil bank too and make some withdrawals and not spend some fertilizer money, which is great. Another result on there to interpret, and this is maybe getting a little bit more in the weeds, so I just, they're generalizations, but some ideal ranges for what's called base saturation. So calcium would be 60 to 80. I rarely see 80. So Michigan State, these are their ideal ranges. I typically see 60 to 70 is good. So 60 to 70%. And then magnesium, I typically see 20% is good. Potassium base saturation between 2 to 6. And then hydrogen's tricky because that varies on pH. So we're not really going to talk about that one. But going back to the results sheet, is it'll somewhere on your results sheet here at the bottom in the corner, it'll say your base saturation. This one's at a 67% calcium, 29% magnesium, and a 3.2% potassium. So those are good. Those are all kind of good numbers, and we'll have a good result with that soil. So base saturation's another one to look at. Then on here too, there's a whole bunch of micros. In general, those are going to vary. What I would tell you is look up your state and what their guidelines are, or the lab. They could help you as well, but they do vary. Like I said, even with phosphorus, potassium, they vary by state. With the micros, they can vary as well. So we're talking boron, manganese, zinc, sulfur. You might want to just look at your talk to the lab, look at your university guidelines and see what's best for those. Those actually, a lot of times too, I like to compare a farm or multiple farms within themselves too, and look for just a lot of outliers, ones that are extremely high or low, and alert them that way. So you might want to look at all your soil tests and go like, well, holy man, this field for sulfur is only a 1, where the rest of my fields are at a 3. Something, I got to change something there, or something's different. So some of the micros you can, in all these things, you could compare to yourself. You're also, this is your grade book. So you can look at how well you did, and you can compare it to yourself. A lot of time is not a bad way to do it, because if something's low in fertilizer versus everything else, well, that's where you want to spend your fertilizer dollar, or that's where you want to put your manure. The other big one that I want to drive home today, and the cheapest, easiest fix for your fertility plan, is pH. So pH is, and this goes back to, your middle school science, where you talked about, what is neutral is 7. And in general, our crops have different demands, but in general, they like it a little bit more acidic, because nutrients are more available to them at a little slight acidity. So they want like a 6.4 to a 6.8 is what they're hoping for. Okay. So if your pH is very low, like in the 5s, lime is just the easiest way. So one of the ways we're looking at right now is getting a variable rate lime map. So in this map, there's spots in the blue that are going to get 5 tons, and there's spots, that are red that are actually going to get no tons, and then yellow's kind of in the middle. And so we can look at pHs of different areas and put lime where it's needed. So depending on the area you work in, you may go like, lime isn't, we're fine. In general, pHs are good. But what I would tell you is it is something to be vigilant about and watch. And it's just the cheapest, easiest way to fix all of your other problems, because if pH is in line, then your nutrients will be more available to your crop. If it's not in line, then all of what you do and spend your money on fertilizer or manure, it's still going to be less available to that crop. Our soils, unfortunately, some areas in Wisconsin have a very high pH, and high is considered about 7.5 or more. And there we got to use sulfur applications, something acidic like that, to try to bring it down, to help with that. So pH is something too I want you to watch. Is immediately I want your eyes to go in that soil test we looked at. I mean, this is at a crazy pH. And this one surprised me. When I got this soil test back, previously the pH was in the sixes and was fine. This is one I just got back this fall, and it's a 5.2 with areas down at 4.7, 4.4. This would be an immediate one that we're going to try to get lime on this fall to help it and to start bringing it back up. So that's some of these. When you look at it too, you do want to look at what's the easy fixes, and lime is a very easy fix, very something we could do right away, and a pretty reasonably cost fix to do. Next thing to talk about with soil sampling is variable rate fertilizer. So when you go out there and then if you use a zone or the grid sampling, you'll have different areas that have different amounts of nutrient there. And then we can follow up and apply nutrient, do variable rate nutrients. So we make a rec through a software, send that off to the co-op. They plug it in their machine. We've done variable rate manure recs before where we've varied that. So they'd look something like this picture where you got different colors or zones, and different ones are going to get a higher rate. In this case, the red is going to get a high rate, and then the green doesn't need as much fertilizer, so that's going to get a low rate. So we've done it where we base manure applications off of phosphorus, and then we can vary that to try to put more phosphorus in spots that need it and less in other spots. One tricky part with that, with manure, is then your nitrogen is also out there as a variable rate application. So then we make an inverse nutrient rec with nitrogen to make sure we apply the correct areas to get nitrogen. But the one other way is you flat rate your manure, see over time where it may be getting a little higher, lower, and then use your fertilizer dollar and spend that on fertilizer to vary that. That's worked well on the dairies that I work with, that we've kind of watched that. And okay, especially potassium is just a nutrient that is a very high demand nutrient in our forages in both corn silage and alfalfa. So we'll have flat rate manure out there, and then we'll variable rate the potassium and put that where it's needed. So some of the fields we've been doing this for I've got some back, over 20 years of soil samples. So in this field's case, we're on our 6th round of soil sampling. One of the things I thought, and this is a field that had a field we've done, this is one of the original ones I soil sampled, and it was the original one that we did variable rate on for many years. So what I thought we'd see is the variability kind of close, that the goal is to bring the bottom up and the top down and get it more even. Some fields have been able to do that. Unfortunately, not all of the cases. There's times where we started back in 2006 with a low field, so it tested low, and we were able to move the test up, but the variability also went up. So in this case, there's a field that we've got a 70 potassium at the low end, and we were able to move that 70 to a 76 in basically, this is like almost 15 years. But then the high end, we also moved up from a 102 high to a 162. So we did what we wanted and increased the average, but we didn't always do it the way we wanted to. So that is one tricky thing with variable rate, is it needs new samples, every 3 years, so that we can dial it in each time and try to make that better and try to pull out that variability. But as we're getting better better softwares to track this, one of the new things we're tracking is the coefficient of variance. So in this particular field, it had a 10% coefficient of variance in 2006, and then back in 2001 one of the last refreshing samples that had a coefficient of variance of 19%. So it actually went up. And that's when we did variable rate fertilizer on. So I thought we'd actually have, the goal was to shrink that. So, and one of the nice parts now with this coefficient of variance is we can see how variable your soil is, or the computer tells me that. And then that tells me if I need variable rate fertilizer or not. So in this case, if we're over about, around that 10% or over, we do want to use variable rate because we can get that variance down. And then especially at 19%, you would want to use it. So what is neat with the new, there's AI coming into this space. There's also just better tools to analyze the data. So some of it's actually getting, I want to say, taken out of our hands. You still need somebody looking at it and trying to dial it in, but there's a lot newer softwares, newer tools that are able to help us dial that in a lot better and just get real specific. So good. Thank you, Caitlin. I want to end with any questions that anybody did have. Maybe talk about some specific, especially to the dairy side of how this affects them. I was trying to be specific to that, but crop farmers seem to worry about, but crop farmers don't have the manure side. So as dairymen, it's so much nicer. We have the advantage of having manure to help us, and then the soil test to sort of guide those applications.
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate you trying to tie it back into dairying. One question that I do have for you is farms with limited resources. Are there ways to prioritize which fields to test? Of course, being with those limited resources, you have to make tough calls. And how can producers kind of navigate that?
Right. That's a great question because this is a year where you are going to want to, every year we have limited resources. However, with these inputs being so costly, we really want to make sure we just dial that in, make sure it pencils. So specifically to soil sampling, I would say fields that if you've never done it before, this is going to be tricky. If you haven't soil sampled in the past, that makes it harder because we don't know where you're at. In general, though, a dairyman's going to know that the fields around the farm typically are higher in nutrients, typically are just fine. So if it's a field that, is within distance where you can hose manure, you're probably fine. And a lot of old pastures, we come back, my grandpa's old pastures tested high. It'll test high all of my lifetime. So to keep retesting it and we know it's going to be high, I'm not saying what's the point, but it's if we got limited resources, you don't need to know that as often and as much. So what I would say is the far away fields, for sure, the fields that are furthest from your manure pit, furthest from your fertilizer source, those probably are going to need to know where they're at, and then you can dial in where how much fertilizer to spend. The other caveat on a dairy farm would be the fields that you're going to put commercial fertilizer on. Those would be the other ones I'd like to have a soil test because then I know how much to purchase. Whereas if you're going to put manure on it, in general, you'll be able to capture crop need from that manure. So it's less important that way. You might need it to meet your nutrient management plan, but maybe not. And then if you have old soil tests, so if you've got, 3, 4, whatever year old soil tests, 2-year, like 10-year-old, I don't care. If you have older soil tests, the other part to look at would be go back to those soil tests, which fields did have a lot of variability and were lower. Those I want to retest to see how much they changed. If they're very high and you've been keeping up with manure or some nutrient allocations, they're probably okay. So I would, in general, go to the ones that have tested lower. The last thing I would say on that is what does help with soil testing is if we have a problem field, or as you're doing harvest right now, or you just wrapped up with corn silage harvest a couple weeks ago, which fields maybe yielded poorly, didn't do as well as you thought, have a problem that you want to try to do, those you want to soil test to help to see if that problem can be alleviated with the information you get from that soil test.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Todd. And I know you covered a lot of great information. Are there one or two things you want our viewers to take home with them today and really think about while they carry out their day?
Right. Soil testing for some of our listeners is just flat out required. that they don't really have much of a choice in it. So that's a tough one. But what I wanted to say to those ones listening is make sure you use that data as much as you can because there's still a lot of value to that data. So if you're required under your nutrient management plan, you have to take them anyway. Make sure every time you're reviewing that data in the fall and looking through it, how can we change? How can we make things better? How can we help? One of the nice parts with that is you're required to take it, say, every 4 years. You might have 20 years worth of data. So start looking at trends on your farm. I've started to plot organic matter trends for farms, phosphorus trends, potassium trends. And when you see that as a whole farm trend, either you're going up or down or the same, you can use that to make a lot of management decisions and you don't get caught in the minutia of one specific spot in a field or one thing. You can start making larger level decisions for your whole farm and start to benefit it to see which way we're going. Um, then there might be a set of listeners that's the opposite. They're either not required to soil sample, by a nutrient management, and then they just say, well, do I really want to spend the money this year to do that? And I'm going to go back to what fertilizer cost. Phosphorus is quite expensive. It's quite high. If you're planning to apply any phosphorus or potassium, make sure you have an up-to-date soil test to do that because then you know how to spend that dollar. And in general, soil testing, it's gone up in price. Don't get me wrong, in the last 20 years, but in general, it's flat. I mean, it's still cost very much the same as what it did, and it doesn't vary with your fertilizer prices. So the one nice part of that is the amount of fertilizer to the amount of what it costs to soil test. It's not even close. As the dollars you save by soil testing are real dollars that will help you on a year like this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Todd. And I just want to say thank you to our viewers for tuning in today. I just want to remind everyone that we have a lot of great programs coming up at Professional Dairy Producers. If you go to our website, pdpw.org, and click on upcoming programs, you will see all the different programs that we have to offer here coming up right before Christmas. We have something for everyone. I just want to give another shout out to our national partners. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put on programs like the Dairy Signal. And with that, I just want to thank everyone again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on the Dairy Signal.